Hey, this is the Level Up Engineering Podcast, where we talk with some of the most successful tech leaders who reveal actionable management insights that help you take your developer team to the next level. This episode was brought to you by Coding Sans, a software development agency building web applications with Angular and Node.js. Check them out at codingsans.com.
Hi there, Carolina Todd speaking, and this is the Level Up Engineering Podcast. Today, my guest is a seasoned professional who has an impressive resume. He played a huge role in the success of Ustream, which was acquired by IBM, and I had the honor of collaborating with him in the preparation of the Stretch conference, and then I witnessed his exemplary determination as well. Today, my guest is Gergely Hodicska, aka Felhő, who is currently the VP of Engineering at Bitrise. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here.
We are so happy to have you. Please tell us a bit about yourself and what you're passionate about.
I started my career as a backend engineer. I was involved in websites, part of Elasticsearch, so with very huge traffic. And I really liked building these distributed systems and systems with high availability. And then I started to turn my attention into management and leadership because there are many people who are very talented in engineering, but I think less people is interested in these topics. And I realized that if we want to improve as an organization, then we need to improve this capability as well. Even my role changed a lot. I became an engineering manager, then senior engineering manager. Of course, nowadays my understanding of being an engineering manager is very different than what I did like 15 years ago or 10 years ago. But nowadays, I'm very passionate about anything related to leadership, management, organizational development. Culture is a very important topic for me. I'm very dedicated to creating a culture where people can thrive and they can move towards their full potential. So creating such an environment is maybe the most important aspiration for me, even at Bitrise.
Thank you. It sounds like you are the perfect guest for this episode. So let's jump right in and say today our topic of discussion is around the importance of soft skills in engineering leadership and in leadership in general. So let's start by exploring why we talk so much about soft skills these days and perhaps let's define what those are in your head so we can all be on the same page.
Let me start that we tend to call those soft skills, but probably those are the hard skills. And even nowadays, many people just call them like people skills or leadership skills. And I can confidently say that those can be really hard because it's difficult to learn them and difficult to get good at them. And it takes some time to internalize them. And by people skills, we can think about like empathy, facilitation, collaboration, negotiation, conflict resolution, and many of those topics. And by leadership skills, it can be like articulating a vision, establishing a strategy, balancing operational and strategic concerns, acting as a servant leader, and many others, communication. So there are so many topics which belongs under this umbrella. And I think in this discussion, I will mainly focus on the people skills, because I think even among the soft skills, the people skills are the harder soft skills. So I think the reason why soft skills are more important because the world changed a lot in the last few decades. So if you think about everything is just much more complex, customer behaviors, the market, everything is much more complex. We just coined this term, this VUCA word, which means like volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And it may sound a bit like bullshitty, but actually this is what is happening in the world right now. The organizations are facing with a much higher pace of change, driven mainly by globalization and and the change of technology. And if the internal change capability of an organization cannot meet this external change demand, then that company will quickly or slowly die. Another big change is the millennials. So now more and more people will grow up in a network-based society. So they are not really working in a more hierarchical structures. They are trying to connect to purpose much more than the previous generations. So if a company is not aware of this change, for example, then at some point it won't be able to acquire good talents. And if you think about, there are many research, like currently 80% of the employees dislike their job, and around 20% actively disengaged, which means that they are working against their company, which means that there is a huge amount of people potential that we waste nowadays. Another area that we learned recently a lot, how our brain is working. It's pretty much this common sense that we have this fight or flight mode. So for example, if I feel that I'm a bit attacked, then I can react by fighting back or flying away, which was very useful when we were fighting with bears. But now we are fighting with bits. So we are living in a very different world even from this perspective. And even I just recently learned about research in neuroscience that if I'm assigned a task, then it's much harder for my brain to keep up with the energy level. So my attention will just drop over time. But if I'm working on something that I was involved to define, or I'm working on an insight of my own, then it's much easier to keep my attention level because my adrenaline level and some other chemical levels will be just higher. So even neuroscience can be very interesting to consider here. And of course, we learned a lot about how people, especially adults, learn. So even we need to consider this when we are creating culture or systems. And all of this drive us in a direction that we need to put more effort into soft skills.
Right. What I'm hearing is that there are a few drivers for us talking about soft skills so much. And one of them was you connecting it all to the success of the business, which is, of course, so important economically to every company to be successful. And then when you made the point about ownership or emotional ownership over tasks rather than being assigned some tasks, you talked about the science behind it, and that makes me feel like soft skills are not so soft after all. They are able to be pinpointed down to neurology and empirical research. So we are not, after all, talking about some touchy-feely subject. This is science, right?
Yes, and this is why it's very essential that companies improve the soft skills of employees. If you think about right now, the most common leadership style is this paternal leadership, and most of the organizations are hierarchical or very bureaucratic organization, and those organizations are not really successful anymore. And all those companies are really feeling this pain. There are tons of books about how you can improve on this. So this is a huge topic. I think we need better leadership and better organizational structure with much more flexibility, diversity, to capable to handle all of the issues that I mentioned previously. And we also need a workforce of people who can cope with this much more higher level of complexity, diversity. We need to work together with more people nowadays. So we are relying on much more collaboration and co-creation. And this is another reason why we need to invest into soft skills. And from this perspective, I think it is inevitable for a company to invest into soft skills. But the other side of this coin is that there's a tremendous amount of unlocked potential in people that we are not leveraging nowadays. And if you think about nowadays, most of the interactions in a company are more ego-based. People are less self-aware. So for example, collaboration in many cases are tainted by unconscious fear-based reaction. Even if you think about an average meeting, I'm not sure whether you had this experience or not, but sometimes it just takes like at least half an hour just to get all the people to sit at the same table, because everybody is approaching the topic through their own fears. And even this is a huge waste of energy. And the same happens on leadership level as well. So many leaders are very ego-driven, thinking in silos, kingdoms, hierarchies, central strategies. And this pretty much limits the sense-making capability of the whole organization. And even if the leader is very smart, usually the collective intelligence always overwin that smart. So if that collective intelligence is not leveraged, then the company cannot be really, really innovative. And again, we are missing a lot of potential. So if we are not investing into these skills, then I think the companies will slowly or quickly dies. And maybe this sounds a bit harsh, but even I just read about a recent McKinsey research which says that the average lifespan among the Standard & Poor's top 500 companies in 1985, it was 61 years, and now it's less than 18 years. And according to McKinsey, by 2027, 70% of those companies will disappear. This is a broader context why we need to be more conscious about soft skills.
So it kind of sounds like soft skills are the glue that pulls a company together. So what are some of the essential soft skills, in your opinions, for engineering managers and for leaders in general to have?
I would add a side note that I think in most of the cases, I wouldn't make a difference between official leaders and the other people inside the company. I really like the definition that leadership means that influencing others to take an action for a better outcome. And from this perspective, everybody inside the company is a leader, and it makes sense from the company's perspective to invest into them as leaders, because if you have more and more leadership capability, then that organization will be able to operate on a higher level. And if you think about this, the trend is that we are going to less and less hierarchical organization, which means that more and more responsibility will be on the teams while working on the edges close to the customers. So even from this perspective, it makes sense to invest into everybody inside the company from this perspective. But to go back to your original question, I think there are some traits which I think are very important, like growth mindset, you mentioned ownership, resilience, grit, and something I call the creator mindset versus the victim mindset, which is about that, the victim always see the situations that, okay, I'm the victim of the circumstances and I have not much to do to deal with the situation. On the other hand, the creator takes responsibility and actively shapes the reality, and they try to turn every situation into an opportunity. And the reason I mentioned first these skills or more traits, that usually we consider these traits as more hardwired. So by nature, I'm good at this or not. But if we go deeper, then there is many ways to improve on these areas as well. And even from this perspective, I think emotional intelligence is the most important soft skills. And this is a big umbrella. There are many, many skills. We can group them into 4 big groups. One is self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. And now I will just quickly mention the most important aspects of emotional intelligence. So I think it's very important to understand what really emotions are, how they are working. Even one can read about a bit how the brain is working from this perspective. And the reason why this is very important, because we tend to think in a way that IQ is very important, but according to many research shows that emotional intelligence contributes much more to the success of people. So 80% is emotional intelligence and 20% is IQ. So even from this perspective, this is very important. Then it is important that I can understand my strengths and my weaknesses, and I try to improve my weaknesses, but I also invest into my strengths because the return is much higher if I invest into my strengths. Then the next level is emotional self-control, because as I mentioned, in many cases, we feel that we are attacked. Of course, we are not always aware of this. This is why self-awareness is important. So when I'm attacked, I'm reacting in a very different way. And again, there is neuroscience behind this. So this is how our brain is wired by default. But we are not a victim of our brain as well. So we can improve on this if we practice. Another big topic is like providing and receiving feedback. Even later, I will share my own story about this because I needed to improve a lot on this field. Another area is self-confidence, which is something that somebody can work on to be more self-confident. And especially if I'm in a leadership position, it's very important that I have self-confidence. But even from that perspective, that if I'm asked to do something that I don't agree with, then I should be okay to raise my voice. So even from this perspective, self-confidence is very important. Then integrity, transparency is very important, like making smart promises, delivering those promises. If I'm making a mistake, then I'm okay to acknowledge it, to show vulnerability, and to act according to my own values. Then adaptability is doer mindset, which means it's pretty much I mentioned this creator mindset is very important. And empathy is very important in a social context. And it's very important to highlight that this is not sympathy. So it's not like I start feeling your feeling, but I pay attention to your feeling. I provide my full attention to you. I listen to you. I understand your situation, and then I act accordingly. Service orientation, and it's not just in that context like servant leadership, but serving the customer, serving all the stakeholders. If we want to be a bit fluffy, then we can say like serving the planet, which is nowadays more and more important. Another big
I
topic
wouldn't say it's fluffy.
I agree. Inspiring others, influencing them, managing conflicts is another big topic that one can or should improve. Developing others, especially in the former leadership roles. But even again, I think everybody is kind of mentor in an organization, because there will be tons of times when I need to show you something. And in this umbrella, one can learn about coaching, mentoring, how to provide good and continuous feedback. Another big topic is driving change. We learned about it at Stretch recently. How many aspects is driving a successful change initiatives. Building network is again very important, as we are working in more and more complex organization, and the formal structure will fade away. So it's very important that we build our network that we can rely on. And building a high-performing team and organization is also very important from this perspective as well. And this was just the emotional intelligence part, and I collected some other interesting topic, like understanding different leadership styles. And I don't go into details here, but if you search for it, then you can find many materials related to it. Creating the right culture. This is again a big topic, and I had like a 2 hours long talk on this topic, so I'm very passionate about it. maybe in a future occasion of the podcast, I'm happy to talk about that one as well. I think personal productivity is very important. And it's very important that from this perspective, leaders should be role model for the others. Because I can have whatever good intent, but if I'm not good at delivering things and I'm not productive enough, then I won't be able to make an impact. Then habit building is another very important topic, even on the personal level, but even on the organization level. Because if you think about any successful change initiative, means that I want to make a new behavior a habit. Because if I cannot make this new behavior habit, then the organization will fall back to the previous state. And the whole change initiative will be a failure. Decision making is another big topic that one can invest to. There are many different aspects how we are making decision. Improving my skills on that is very important from a leadership perspective. Then facilitation is another important topic. Many people say nowadays that actually facilitation is the next most important leadership style. And again, if you think about that, we are heading to organizations which are more like network-based, not having formal authorities, then facilitation is a very important technique to understand where the organization are, to be able to bring up the pain points and to be able to harness the collective intelligence of the whole organization. Continuous learning is something that one should invest. And this includes I need to build out the sources of inspiration, and it's up to you which sources you use, like following people on Twitter or listening to podcasts or reading articles, books. But I think it's very important to find some inspirations because of course, it's very important that I should learn from my own experiences as well. But if I'm only focusing on optimizing my own local context, then I can only get to a local maximum. But if I try to find some inspiration, then I will discover some other mountains. So maybe I can reach to
a global maximum.
Yes, the global maximum. And there is always something where we can improve. So even from this perspective, this is very important. And at least for me, for example, I always have a framework in my mind where we could get as an organization. And I'm fueling this vision by this source of inspirations. And if I don't have this vision, then it's very hard to move my organization anywhere. But if I have a strong picture where we would like to get, then there is a much higher chance that we will get there. And I think it's important that you should invest into yourself because maybe it's more like an Eastern European thing, but many people don't really invest into themselves. They wait for their companies that, okay, my company should train me. But I think it's a very stupid approach because this is how I can stay competitive on the market. And even with just buying a book, which is not a huge investment, I can learn a lot. But there are tons of good workshops and trainings that I can learn a lot. And even from this perspective, it's important to understand how I can learn, how my brain is working from a learning perspective. How can I trick my brain? And there are topics like spaced repetition learning that can help a lot to acquire more knowledge or keep it or be able to remember for it. Or even there is a phenomenon that if there are more stimuli around the learning, then there is a higher chance that I will remember for it. This is, for example, group learning can be very efficient versus I'm just learning alone. Another big topic is, which I really like, is multi-perspective thinking, because many people, and even there is a developmental model behind this, how adults are going through like 3 major stages. One is called the socialized mind. When I'm on this stage, usually I try to please others. The next level is the self-authoring mind. which means that I just created my ego. And usually I try to think on a way that I know the truth, and my truth should be the truth.
Universal.
Yes. And the next level is the self-transforming mind, when I realized that there are so many truths in the world. And even at the same moment, it is possible that there are multiple, somewhat conflicting truths are true. And especially, I even wouldn't say that from a leadership perspective, this is important, but even as an employee, I realized many times, for example, with tech lead, that they were kept by this capability, actually not by technical skills. And what was very interesting, that one technical lead was a bit envious for another one, and he perceived that other person that he's playing politics. But actually, this was not the case, but the other person was capable to understand multiple perspectives and come up with a synthesis of them, and come up with a solution which was pleasing all the other stakeholders. And this way, that person was much more capable to drive their own agenda. So even from this perspective, this is important that we improve from this perspective. And of course, there are mental models, cognitive biases, which are very important. And the last thing I would mention, it's called spiritual intelligence, which is kind of the next level of emotional intelligence. And I don't want to go into too much details of this, because I know that for many people, this word spirituality, it's like they attach like religion or some esotericism to it, which is not necessarily the case. For me, this is much more about consciousness, how conscious I am in the present. And I just want to mention two sources if you are interested in this topic. If you search for the 15 commitments of conscious leadership, then you will find the website and the book about this topic. And we recently processed the book together with my engineering management team. It's a book from Fred Kaufman, Conscious Business, and I really recommend that book.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that list. It seems like it was an exhaustive list, and I'm sure that our listeners will either have to take notes or check out the blog posts written of the conversation, because there was a lot to research and a lot to read about. And with that said, before we continue with the second part of this episode, let me tell you a little bit about Coding Sense, the sponsor of the podcast and the company I work for. We are a full-stack web development agency building complex, market-ready products from design to delivery. We work with the latest web development technologies such as React, Angular, and Node.js. Our team has extensive experience with all cloud providers and production experience with serverless technologies. If Level Up Engineering has been bringing you value, consider Coding Sense to build your product. Check us out at codingsense.com. And now, back to the show. It's been kind of theoretical or conversation, and you talked a lot about what is under the umbrella of soft skills or people skills that we're talking about. And I'm sure if, dearest listeners, if you start researching, you will find a lot of food for thought. I personally have recognized a couple of books that I have already read when you were talking. So thank you for bringing all that together. But let's dive a little deeper into who you are and how you came to be this lexicon of soft skills and leadership. So what was your progress? Were you always interested in soft skills as an engineer, or how did that go for you?
Not really, but I just got some feedback that made me thinking that I should invest more into this topic. I had a very good friend at the Ustream, and he told me that we had an argument which was quite heated, and he told me, okay, this is why I don't like to work with you. Hearing this from a friend was like, hey, I'm just trying to find the best solution. But it turned out that this not was the case, but I was trying to defend my ego. in that conversation. So this was, for example, one of the moments that made me thinking that, okay, maybe I should improve, or I just need to try making some research, okay, why I'm working this way or why I'm behaving in some discussion this way. And I started to realize some of my psychological drivers. The two most important for me is that, and I don't want to go into details like why that might happen, because there might be very different belief among the people. Some people think that I'm victim of my previous life, I'm victim of my parents, I'm victim of my birth. There are so many ideas how I get some issues in the past that influence the way how I'm behaving now. But what I realized that for me, being right, I was pretty much attached to being likable. And the other was that being useful was pretty much attached to being likable. And of course, for any person, being likable is very important. This is part of like our core identity. So if I even unconsciously feel that I'm losing that likability, then I need to fight for it. And of course, it's ironically, when I was fighting for it, I was not the most lovable person. So even from this perspective, if I try to understand those triggers, then I have a much better chance to stay likable. And what is really cool in this topic, and I will later talk about it a little, that if I start realizing these triggers, then I can turn them into a superpower, like a spider sense. Another big topic was me, like, how can I be more conscious in more and more situations? Because when I started to learn about these topics, then I realized that I'm absolutely not conscious in many situations. Another big topic was for me, as I mentioned, like providing and receiving feedback, which is pretty much is related to the previous topic. Because in many cases, I become very defensive when I receive the feedback, or if I feel that I'm very criticized, then even sometimes I just attack back. And I was very good with words, so I was able to win those arguments in many cases. But let's say that I lost the war by winning those battles. And in many cases, my driver was when I'm giving feedback, not necessarily helping the other party, but like controlling or showing that I'm very smart, or even in some cases, like dominating the discussion. So even from this perspective, investing into self-awareness is very important, because otherwise, in many cases, we will just driven by the autopilot, and those reactions are not necessarily the best that we can do. Another very interesting topic for me was the relationship of control and impact. Because when I was, let's say, less mature, then I was very sensitive about somebody's crossing my area that I was leading, or the boundaries. I really wanted to control what is happening there. And because of that, I was less collaborative as I should have. Thus, this behavior was limiting the growth or the overall impact of that area. So actually, it was not the best strategy, but I was not aware of it, and I was not conscious about my presence in that dynamics. And in my mind, my impact was connected to this controlling function. And as I mentioned, this way, I was pretty much limiting my impact, because I didn't help to assume a broader set of responsibilities. Because, even my boss at that time perceived me that I'm not somebody who is very great at collaborating with on a broader level. I was a bit defensive. And when I started to understand that what is behind this behavior from a self-awareness perspective, I was able to give up this control and nurture a more rich cooperation with the rest of the organization. And as a result, I was invited to have a higher level of responsibility. And this is when I became the VP of Engineering at Ustream. So even from this perspective, it was a fruitful investment. And what was very paradoxical in this, when I give up control, I assume more impact.
How nicely
So,
said.
yes. Another hardship for me was building less frames. And by that mean that it is very natural part of how we are thinking that we are creating like mental frames and we are absorbing the world through those lenses, which means that even at the input, I'm distorting the reality. And for me, it was very easy to put somebody into a box, and it was not necessarily easy for them to get out of that box. And the issue was that, and even nowadays, I realize that if I have a conflict, and if I'm reflecting back, okay, what actually happened here, then sometimes I can find some thoughts which were important that I run into this conflict mode. And those thoughts were not necessarily true, but those were coming through one of the frame that I developed. So this is something that I'm actively trying to work on, to try to be not presented with those frames, or try not building those frames, but try to assess every situation as a separate or distinct situation.
Wow. And thank you. You have mentioned a few things that you tried to improve on, and how these improvements ended up being successful, but how did you improve? What did you do? What can somebody who is listening to us do to improve besides buying a couple books?
So as I mentioned, I think the most important aspect is emotional intelligence. So this is where I would start. And of course, I learned a lot about so many aspects of engineering, leadership, organizational design. But I think the most impactful was improving my self-awareness. That helped me to understand what were those subconscious triggers that turned me into this fight or flight mode. And after a while, I started to better control my emotion in those situations. And as you somewhat mentioned, that this was a long trip, so it was not happening from one day to the other. I think the first step was like I started to learn about personality types, but this was not really giving me an answer, because learning about personality types just helped me to understand why others are stupid. But when I started to improve my self-awareness, and for me this was happening, I was taking part of a coaching school, and then I started to learn much more about myself. And I tend to say that this is where I started to realize why I'm stupid. So I started to learn coaching. I started to learn nonviolent communication. And this is, for example, something I would really recommend to everybody. You can think about it a bit like a Trojan horse, because on the surface, this is like a communication tool. And why shouldn't I improve myself from a communication perspective, especially in a leadership role? But if I start learning about nonviolent communication, especially if I have a good teacher, then this will start a self-awareness journey. So I will start learning about myself, about my emotions. Even I start building that capacity that at the same moment I can focus on what is happening in this discussion, but I still have some capacity to check my own emotions, which are very important, because if I'm not aware of my own emotions, then I can't control them. It's very simple. And I learned many other techniques. So I was participating in many workshops. Even I can't recall all of them, but all of them just gave me some nuggets. And even sometimes not necessarily the knowledge was important, because usually I have much more knowledge that what I really leverage. But in some cases, I just had a very body level experience that, wow, this seems interesting. So from that point, I started to have the motivation for really leveraging that knowledge. And I think you mentioned that I'm a kind of lexicon, but actually this is a trap, because sometimes I'm spending much more time with acquiring new knowledge than working on myself. So even this can be a trap, that I'm learning a lot, but not leveraging that knowledge. But I think it's really important that I need to create space for self-reflection. this is probably the most important aspect. This can be just dedicated time. It can be journaling, being in a coaching session with somebody. And what was an interesting experience for me that, as I mentioned, I was part of many heated discussions. And when I started to work on myself then, and I started to reflect back those events, then I started to find what was my responsibility on those situations and what was those very moments when I started to go south and when I started to lose the control over my emotions. And as I was practicing this more and more, then the delta between when this happened and when I did the reflection was smaller and smaller. And after a point, in many cases, this could become real time. So I started to build that capacity that I can understand real time. Oops, okay, now I'm triggered. Okay, now I need to improve my consciousness. Otherwise, I will go into this fight or flight mode. And this helped me a lot. And I mentioned that we can consider these triggers as weaknesses. But if I'm thinking from this creator mindset, we can turn them into kind of superpower. So when I started to improve my self-awareness, then I started to feel some body sensation when I started to go into, let's say, the stupid modes. And over time, this develops. So now even when I'm writing an email and I'm just trying to poke somebody even a little, then this spider sense just bring the bells that, hey, you are doing something bad. You should think about it. And even sometimes I decide to follow that path because sometimes these heated discussions or this type of dynamics can give a lot of energy or kind of experience. But of course, nowadays I'm much more conscious when I'm doing this, and I try to avoid doing it.
Awesome. So just so we can clarify, it sounds like the thing that helped you most was building your self-awareness that helped you find the direction to not get lost in the entire knowledge base of soft skills of the internet or our world. But what methods did work for you? What did you do to be more self-aware? You mentioned that somebody gave you feedback once and that was very powerful, but how did you start building your own self-awareness dictionary?
So as I mentioned, for me, the most impactful was nonviolent communication from this perspective and this coaching school I was taking, because there, even we were practicing coaching and I just learned about, many models which are behind this situation. And when I started to understand, okay, what does it mean that I have subconscious triggers, then even on a cognitive level, I was able to connect the dots. And of course, this is a never-ending journey. So this is not something, okay, I'm done, I'm good. This is something that I need to continuously put effort into it. I need to reflect into the situation. And even nowadays, feedback can be really helpful because if somebody providing me a feedback which is about a very different reality, which is my reality, then I need to think about it. And this is why I was participating in many other types of workshops, because in many cases, what I gained from those workshops, just being aware of a new trigger. Oh, I have this trigger as well. And maybe this is not for everybody because I'm a person who is living most of my times in my head, which is not good. So I'm a very cognitive driven person. But for me, it can really help if I start understanding something, then I'm good at building those triggers and using those rules or experiences to assess the current situations.
All right. Thank you. Now that we have established that, what soft skills, in your opinion, are typically a problem to acquire for engineers? Let's not differentiate between engineering managers or leaders and engineers, for engineers in general.
Emotional intelligence. Of course, and this self-awareness topic, I think is very important because this is the foundation of everything else. Because if I'm self-aware, then I put myself into a situation that I can consciously decide about my reaction and not being driven by the autopilot that I mentioned. As I mentioned, I would really send everybody to a nonviolent communication training, and this can be a good starting point. And even I realized on myself that as I was not needed to spend as much time with my ego, it improved tremendously my listening skills. So now I'm much better at understanding a situation, understanding many different perspectives, and how can I merge them together, and how can I synthesize a win-win situation. So even from this perspective, this can be very useful. And also, NVC helps a lot to take responsibility, which I think is another important area for everybody, which is related to this creator-victim mindset that I should take more and more responsibility about what is happening around me. Because what I noticed, and this is again true for leaders and non-leaders as well, that if there's a problem or an issue, then we try to think about it that it is more about the attitudes of people. But in many cases, this is not true, especially because we can't assess the attitude of somebody. We can just notice what you say, what you do, but I can't assess your attitude. But there are many biases here, like this fundamental attribution error, which is about if something bad happening, then we try to overemphasize the internal attributes of a people and emphasize the external circumstances. But if I try to think on a way that if there is a system and the system drives the behavior, then in most of the cases what's happening that the people are taking the role that the system directs to them. So in many cases, if I try to think about what parts of the system or the environment is responsible for driving that behavior, then I will find much more options to improve. And even if I try to think about how am I responsible for that situation, I can again find some very, very interesting exit or resolution. And this is a very, very, very interesting aspect that I would like to highlight, because in many cases how we think about what was happening, sometimes we are thinking that there was some kind of cause and the effect. But in many cases this is not true, because with my own communication I can shape or create reality. If you think about if I'm very judgmental with you, then you will be defensive. And then I can say, hey, why are you defensive? I just told you some things. The other part of this equation is that I have some mental models about the given situation, and those mental models have a very strong influence on my communication. So actually what is happening that my own mental models creates reality.
For you.
Not just for me, even in the external world. To give you a very easy to understand example, there are those very typical bosses who believes that people in general are lazy and I need to push them to get results. So what is happening that I start to micromanage them. Even probably my communication, they can feel that I don't trust them. And what is happening in that environment, probably you won't be super engaged and you will probably deliver the minimum expected result. And what is happening on my side, that my mental model is reinforced.
Yeah, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes, and this is why this was a very tangible example. But actually, this is happening all the times with all of us. And the biggest trap in this is that we are considering this as a learning process. But actually, this is not a learning process, because we are creating a situation that we would like to experience. So even from this perspective, being very aware of how we are impacting the situation is very important, because otherwise we can think that, okay, we can blame others and this was others' fault that we get into this situation. And this is especially important in the relation of company culture, because what is happening. Several times we have very nice words on the wall, or we have some very nice documents about the culture, but many processes or many actions of leaders in the organization are not congruent with those values. And at the end, the culture will be very different. And always this implicit culture always wins over this explicit culture.
Right. If we are talking about the exact culture, we don't have to talk about Bitrise. We can just talk about your direction. How do you kind of help your team to become better with their soft skills? How do you help the engineering managers who are working for you or are on your team, if you are in a more network sort of mindset?
But first, let me adjust one more to the previous topic, and maybe you can edit it. But I forget to mention that providing and giving feedback is something that most people are not very great at. Probably we are shy. We believe that if I give you any candid feedback, that it might hurt our relationship. And again, this is a trap, because if I'm not giving that feedback to you, that will hurt the relationship. Then later, for example, I need to fire you, and then you are surprised that, hey, you never told me that this is an issue. So I think this is an area where we really need to improve, all of us, because feedback is like the oil of the machine. So if you need to put that oil into the machine, then it will erode, and the whole organization will just erode. But back to your question. For me, one of the most important tools, which is not a big surprise, are the one-on-ones, where I try to provide meaningful feedback. And actually, this is something that I really wanted to improve. And even, for example, when I joined Bitrise, it was a very conscious decision that I want to be better, and I want to be more brave or more candid when I'm giving feedback. Actually, it was a great experience, even though it was a bit hard to start. And on the one-on-ones, I try to leverage my knowledge. I try to help people to reflect back on their own situation. I would say that I'm stronger right now at mentoring than coaching, but I try to be stronger at coaching. This is something I would like to approach. But for me, it's very easy. If I'm not very conscious, then for me, it's very easy to turn into this problem-solving mode, which of course is not the best approach from developing others. Then we have some team learning events. As I mentioned, now we just started to process this Fred Kaufman book. And even we are working with an external coach to have some training actually about coaching. Everybody has their own training budget at Bitrise. So even you can learn individually if you want. Oh yes, and I think what is very important, even from this perspective, like leading by example, because as I mentioned, that if leaders think on a way that they are already okay and they don't need to improve, then they just provide a very bad example to the rest of the organization. And as I mentioned, there is always something to learn. So it's very important that I keep learning myself, and I try to share some of those knowledge with the others. Even I can help them this way, and even I can provide a good example for them. And I think the overall culture of the organization can help a lot from this perspective. Because, at many companies, they tend to say that innovation is very important. But actually what is happening, they are very bureaucratic, very risk aware. But for example, at Bitrise, we just stated that we want to have people with growth mindset. We are in hyper growth period, which means that the knowledge I have today, it won't be enough a year from now or 6 months from now. So it's part of the game that we need to learn, because otherwise we won't be able to stay successful. And having a blameless culture is very important for us. We even emphasize that it's absolutely okay to fail. And of course, you shouldn't fail just to fail. You should fail to learn. And I think if we can provide this environment to people, we can accelerate their learning. Because I think the most important learning is what is happening as part of the work.
I have a question here that I'm kind of reluctant to ask because you just mentioned that it's part of your manifesto to have the growth mindset of your people. But if there is any resistance towards improving or towards learning about soft skills or coaching, how do you handle it? What do you do? What do you tell your engineering managers?
So first, I always really try to really understand the situations because, it can be a situation that I think that I have some gifts to you, but you don't need that gift. In that case, there will be resistance because, hey, Felhő, the fuck are you doing here? I don't need it. Also, as I mentioned, I have a vision, so I have a good understanding where we would like to get over time. And I always try to understand, what are the aspirations of the individual people. And among those areas, I can always find some intersection. And if I can find the intersection, then there will be buy-in by default. So there won't be a big resistance. But even, for example, if we design the workshop, we discuss it that, hey, I have this plan. What do you think about it? How should we improve it? Or what should we change on it? So even in many cases, the way how we put together the workshop is a co-creation. And again, this way there will be buy-in because I will be part of defining that workshop. So I think what is very important that it should be meaningful for those who are part of the workshop. Or if there was a case that this is not true, even in that case, I should be very, very clear why I believe that this is very important for us. So decisions should be very, very clear. And my reasoning behind that decision should be very clear because this way I can still get some buy-in.
All right. So when hiring, you just mentioned the growth mindset as something that's explicit with you guys. How do you evaluate? What do you ask? Do you have a soft skill test for people who apply to Bitrise, or what do you do?
So it's part of the default process that we have a cultural interview, and on that cultural interview, we just try to assess the candidate from some of the perspective I mentioned, like growth mindset, receiving, giving feedback, how easy for them is to fail, for example, how easy they can learn. Being data-driven is something important for us. So it's part of the interview process, and we try to make sure that we try to remove biases from the process. So we have scorecards. So it's not I have a very different interview with you than with somebody else. We try to go through the same questions. And in every interview, we have at least two people. And even I noticed in many cases that my assessment about somebody was very different than my peers. So even this is very, very useful to remove some biases from the process. And for example, in the case of the engineering managers, I'm doing the hiring manager interview. And the hiring manager interview is much more about the people skills. So I try to assess, what is their leadership, ars politica, what is their tool set, how they are dealing with people, how they are dealing with a conflict. So we try to understand. And it was a bit sad experience to me that in many cases I noticed that there were some great candidates from that perspective that I think they had great values and great mindset, but they socialized in very bad companies or with companies with not ideal culture, or at least from our perspective, not ideal culture. And because of that, they were not a good fit for us. But my impression was that people management at many of the companies nowadays is not really important or not really done well, which is kind of sad because only people can realize anything at the company. So it's very important that we invest into them and we treat them well. And what is also, I think, is very important that not just the hiring, but the other side of the equation when we let somebody leave the organization. And this is another topic that I noticed that at many places this is not managed well. And even I was not really great at for many times because, I was a bit sad about that person. But the problem is that if I'm not dealing with the lower performance, then I'm actually setting a new standard at the company. And that standard is very bad for multiple reasons. For example, it can signal to people, okay, this is the good enough experience, and many great talents will leave because they would like to be part of an A team, and for them that result is just not good enough. So I can cause a lot of harm if I'm not dealing with removing those people for whom this culture is not a good fit, because it's not necessarily there. It's not like they are good or bad. Just this current environment is not really good for them.
Right. And hence, dearest listeners, be brave when you give feedback to people, and constructive.
Yes.
But that's a given.
Yes.
So
Yes.
we are kind of through with our questions, but I have one thing that I would really like to ask you. If somebody is listening to us from a company where perhaps soft skill training and awareness is not so great right now, what would you suggest be the first step they do? How can someone try to help the company start going in this more self-aware way?
I think one, and this is probably true for any type of change initiatives, it is said that you shouldn't try to fight the stupids. You need to find the first allies. So in many cases, it can work that you start small and you maybe just find some peers and you start a discussion with them. And then maybe you just start crafting some experiments that you will run, like, okay, let's have a small workshop about like nonviolent communication and try to assess that it has a positive impact on the team. And if I can start building some cases, then I can start going to the top level leadership team or a higher level leadership team and showcase them, okay, hey, look, we started to invest into this topic and it has a very positive effect. Because this way I can showcase the impact and I'm not trying to sell something theoretical. So maybe this could be one way of starting. But I think what is very important always to think about in a way that every change to start from the inside. So if I really want to change something externally, then I first need to find what I need to change internally. And this is a very important aspect. And this is, again, from a creator mindset, this means that even if I'm part of a very toxic environment, of course, I always have the option to leave it, but I have always, it's under my decision whether I start to work on myself. And if I start working on myself, then maybe I will better understand whether I have some parts of creating that toxic environment or not. And maybe I can start changing that environment, or probably if not, then I will leave. So there are some dangers if I start to change, but I'm quite sure that the overall journey will be very joyful. There will be some painful parts, but I think the overall impact will be very, very positive.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Is there anything else you would like to add that we haven't touched on and you think is important?
I think you were very extensive with the questions, and I was very extensive with the answers. So I think we are quite good.
All right, that's why we are here. And how can our listeners follow your work?
Actually, nowadays I'm not very active on the social media. Actually, I have a plan to be more active. Even I created a domain leadership starts inside, and I plan to have some blog posts there. But there is only one post there right now, which is actually a mind map about this culture talk that I mentioned. But you can start following me on Twitter, and if I'm activating myself, then I will start sharing this information there.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for jumping on the show. It was so awesome to have you, and thank you for sharing all of this with us, because it's been really extensive and I loved it, honestly. Today, my guest was Gergely Hodicska, aka Felhő, as you might know him. He's the VP of Engineering at Bitrise, and we talked about the importance of soft skills. Dearest listeners, if you've been enjoying the show and haven't done so, please subscribe and leave a review on the Level Up Engineering podcast on Apple Podcasts. I am Karolina Tóth, and I hope to see you next time.
Thanks for staying with Level Up Engineering. If you enjoyed this podcast, so will your friends. Share this episode on your favorite social networking platform. To stay up to date with our content, follow Level Up Engineering on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or Google Podcast. Brought to you by Coding Sans, a software development agency building web applications with Angular and Node.js. Check them out at codingsans.com.